Hello everybody, my name is Nicolas and with my partner Oscar we are going to talk about The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This is the first book that I read from Adeline Virginia Stephen, better known as Virginia Woolf, the British author who was born in London and active in the first part of the 20th century and considered part of the literary modernist movement. To make this review, we read a digital version that came with this cover, but we see more covers on internet. First, we found that this book is so expensive, and second, that all make use the cliche image where only a lighthouse is represented, except in this cover that is from Random House, where it make use of an image of a woman who we assume that is the protagonist, Miss Ramsey. To the Lighthouse was published in 1927. It was her fifth novel and is a semi-autobiographical stream of consciousness novel. This is the kind of narrative for which Virginia Woolf was famous, where it is not at all in their own voice. The voice is in third person, omniscient, and untold feast this all-seeing eye of God, an inquisitive ghost of the voice of physical and subjective reality, the voice of what is definitely as their minds. The whole book is a kind of journey into the lighthouse.
Hello everyone, my name is Oscar and I'm going to talk about my first impression on the book To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This is actually the first time I read Virginia Woolf, and I wanted to read her because of some recommendation of friends that are part of the feminist movement. And yes, it talks about the general condition of the women in that period, especially in the intellectual circles and families. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it talks about some social issues and the human condition that includes women and men. So I think the book talks about the internal struggles that we have with ourselves and the roles that society imposes on us. Another impression is that I've thought for a long time that reading Virginia Woolf is not easy, and they may be right, because this book is not enough of actions of even full or fast, but the importance of the literature of Virginia Woolf is that the reflections around the characters and the melancholy I could notice. The truth is that I began reading the book with the imaginary idea of finding a feminist postulate, especially about that movement that at the beginning of the 20th centuries promoted the vote for women. But more than that, more than the feminist question, it seems to me that the book is very personal and intimate. It seems to me that Virginia Woolf wants to share with us the relationship with her father, with her mother, their marriage. On the other hand, I think Virginia Woolf mixes his personal life very well with the social issues and her view on the English society in that period. I think it also touches on the issues like death, like family relationships, obviously the struggle of women in society, but most of all, I really like it that she tries to talk about the passage of the time.
Virginia Woolf was a writer concerned above all with capturing in the works excitement, pain, beauty, and horror of what she termed the modern age. She realized that the new era, marked by the extraordinary development in urbanism, technology, warfare, consumerism, and finally, life will need to be captured by a different sort of writers. Along with Joyce and Prowse, she was a relentlessly creative writer in search of a new literary forms that could do justice to the complexities of modern consciousness. Her books and essays retain the power to convey the thrill and drama of living in the 20th century. Woolf was born in London. Her father was a famous author and mountaineer, and her mother as well known as a model. Her family hosts many of the most influential and important members of the Victorian Literary Society. Woolf was largely cynical about the grand types, accusing them of pomposity and narrow-mindedness. Woolf and her sister weren't even allowed to go to Cambridge like their brothers, but had to steal an education from their father's study. After her mother died when she was only 13, Woolf had the first of a series of mental breakdowns that would plague her for the rest of her life, partly caused by sexual abuse she suffered at the hands of her half-brother George Dudworth. Despite her illness, she became a journalist and a novelist and the central figure in the Bloomsbury Group, which includes John Maynard Keynes, E. M. Forster, and Leighton Scarcity. She married one of the members, the writer and journalist Leonard Woolf. She and Leonard bought a small hand-printing press named the Howard Press and published books from their dining room. They printed Woolf's radical novels and politician essays when no one else would, the first full English edition of Freud's work. In just 4 short years between World Wars I and II, Woolf wrote four of her famous works: Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, Orlando, and the essay A Room of One's Own. In March 1941, feeling the onset of another bout of mental illness, Woolf drowned herself in the river Ouse. Her work has many vital things to teach us. First, notice everything. Woolf was one of the great observers of English literature. Perhaps the finest short piece of prose she ever wrote was the essay The Death of the Moth, published in 1942. It contains her observation as she sits in her study watching a humble moth trapped by a pane of glass. Rarely have so many profound thoughts been eked out from such a predominantly mindless situation. Thus for Woolf there were no such a thing as mindless situations. One could not help watching him. One was indeed conscious of a queer feeling of pity for him. The possibilities of pleasure seemed that morning so enormous and varied that to have only a month's part in life, and a day months at that, appeared a hard fate, and he zest in enjoying his meagre opportunities to the full pathetic. He flew vigorously to one corner of his compartment, and after waiting there a second, flew across of the other. What remained for him but to fly to third corner and the fourth? That was all he could do in spite of the weight of the sky, the far-off smooth of houses, and the romantic voice, now then, of a steam of a sea. Woolf noticed everything that you and I tend to walk past: the sky, the pain in others' eyes, the gaze of children, the stoicism of wives, the pleasure of department stores, in the interest of harbors and docks. Emerson, One of her favorite writers may have been speaking generally, but he captured everything that makes Woolf special when he remarked, "In the work of writers of genius, we discover our own negligent thoughts." In another great essay on Be Ill, Woolf laments how seldom writers stop to describe illnesses, an oversight that seemed characteristic of snobbery against the everyday in literature. English, which can express the thoughts of Hamlet and the tragedy of Lear, has no words for Shiver and the Hecate. The mere schoolgirl, when she falls in love, has Shakespeare or Keats to speak her mind for her, but let us suffer her trying to describe a pain in his head to a doctor and language at once runs dry. This would be her mission. Woolf tried throughout her life to make sure language would do better job at defining who we really are, with all our vulnerabilities, confusions, and bodily sensations. Woolf raised her sensitivity to highest up front. She had the confidence and seriousness to use what happened to her, the sensory details of her own life, as the basis for the largest ideas. Second, accept the everyday. Woolf was always profound, but never afraid of what others called trivial. She was confident that the ambitions of her mind to love beauty and engage with big ideas were completely compatible with an interest in shopping, cakes, and hats, subjects on which she wrote with almost unique eloquence and depth. In another particularly good essay of hers called "The Oxford Street Tide", she celebrates the gaudy vulgarity of its huge London shopping street. The more or less point the finger of scorn at Oxford Street, it reflects, they say, the levity, the ostentation, the haste, and the irresponsibility of our age. Yet perhaps they are as much out in their scorn as we should be if we ask of the lily, that it should be cast in bronze, or the daisy that should be have petals of imperishable enamel. The charm of modern London is that it isn't built to last, it is built to past. In accompanying essay, equal open to the unprestigious side of the modern life, Woolf goes to visit the giant docks of London. A thousand ships with thousand cargoes are being unlanded every week, and not only is each package of its vast of variety merchandise picked up and set down accordingly, but each is weighed and opened, sampled and recorded, and again stitched up and laid in displays, without haste or waste or hurry, or conscious by a very few men in shirt sleeves who, working with the utmost organization in the common interest, are yet able to pause in their work and say to casual visitors, "Would you like to see what sort of thing with something fine in sacks of cinnamon? Look, it's at the snake." 3. Be a feminist. Woolf was deeply aware that men and women fit themselves into rigid roles, and as they do so, overlook their fuller personalities. In her eyes, in order to grow, we need to do something gender bending. We need to seek experience that blur what it means to be a real man or a real woman. Woolf had a few lesbian affairs in her life, and she wrote a magnificently blood queer text, Orlando, a portrait of her lover Vita described as a nobleman who becomes a woman. She wrote it's fatal to be a man or woman, pure and simple. One must be woman manly or man womanly. In her anti-war track, Three Guineas, Woolf argued that we will only ever end war by rethinking the habit of repeating of sex against sex. All this claiming of superiority and impudent inferiority belong to the private school stage of human existence, where there are sides and it is necessary for one side to beat another side, and of the utmost importance to walk up to a platform and received from the hands of the headmaster a highly ornamental pot. Woolf wished desperately to raise the status of women in her society. She recognized that the problem was largely down to money. Women didn't have freedom, especially freedom of spirit, because they didn't control their own income. Women have always, she cried, not for 200 years merely, but from the beginning of time, women have had less intellectual freedom than the sons of Athenian slaves. Women have not had a dog's chance of writing poetry. Her great feminist rallying cry, "A room of one's own," culminated in a specific political demand in order to stand on the same intellectual footing as men. Women not only needed dignity, but also equal right to education and income of £500 of years, and a room of one's own. Woolf was probably the best writer in the English language for describing our minds without the jargon of clinical psychology. The generation before hers, the Victorians, wrote novels focused on external details, city scenes, marriage wills. Woolf envisaged a new form of expression that would focus instead on how it feels inside to know ourselves and other people. Books like Wolf's, which aren't overly sarcastic, aren't caught up in adventure plots, or cradled in a convention, are our contract. She expecting us to turn down upside volume, to try on her perspective and to spend energy with stalled sentences, and in turn, she offers us the opportunity to notice the tremors we normally miss, and the better appearance modes, our own Hecates, and our fascinating fluid sexualities.
Okay, the story of the book takes place at the beginning of the 20th century, between 1910 and 1920, and we have to take in mind that in that period, Europe and England was living through the First World War. The book doesn't talk about the especially of that event, but we have to take in mind that the context is the First World. The story is about the marriage of the Ramsay, Mr. Ramsay and Mrs. Ramsay, and their 8 children. And I want to highlight the youngest one, called James, and that's important because the request of James is the cause of the conflict or the plot, the main plot of the story. The plot is really simple at first. So the Ramsay family wants to spend some time in their summer house, and upon arrival, James tells his parents that he wants to go to the lighthouse. That's because the name of the book. So James wants to go to the lighthouse, and this simple request triggers the whole plot of the book, which why it is so interesting, because Virginia Woolf takes everyday events and transform them into real social question or into real social issues. And why do I say this? Because Mrs. Ramsay tells James that they can go to the lighthouse next day, but Mr. Ramsay tells her that it will be not happen, because next day will be a bad day. So he begins to see the first conflict in the whole book is the James relationship with his parents, so with his mother and with his father. This relationship is very different, and that's the first. Okay, this is the conflict between James and his parents. On the one hand, there is Mrs. Ramsay, who has to carry the whole family. He has to bring the whole family together, no matter how she feels. And this is not about just Mrs. Ramsay. This is about the entire women who were forced to be housewives. And on the other hand, there is Mr. Ramsay, a self-centered intellectual and philosopher. Mr. Ramsay hates lies, especially to her children, and says he wants his children to force life, to face reality, because life is not easy. Life is not a dream. This is the philosophy of Mr. Life is difficult, facts and compression, and the passage to that fabled land where our brightest hopes are extinguished, our frail barks foundered in darkness, one that needs, above all, courage, truth, and the power to endurance. But this is not the only conflict through the book, as Mr. Ramsay is an intellectual, so his friends are intellectual too. So he decided to invite to his friends who are painters, poets, philosophers, and writers. Here I would like to highlight two characters of the Mr. Ramsay friends, Lily Briscoe and Charles Densley. On the one hand, Lily is a painter who wants to paint a portrait of Mrs. Ramsay and his children. She is an artist, but he is also very insecure about herself, and he is afraid of the criticism of her work. Charles, this is the character, is going to fit Mr. Ramsay ego, as he thinks he is a brilliant philosopher. In that sense, Charles thinks that women should not be artists. Why did she mind what he said? Women can't write, women can't paint. What did that matter coming from him, since clearly it was not true to him, but for some reason helpful to him, but for some reason helpful to him? In that sense, Lily thinks that if Mrs. Ramsay had followed her own way and not lived in the shadow of her husband, she would have achieved much more than Mr. Ramsay. Lily represents women in the world of art, but Lily has her own internal struggle. On the one hand, she is insecure, but she also fights for equality, especially in the world of art. And the third part, called The Lighthouse, begins with the Ramsay family planning the same trip that they had planned 10 years before. Mr. Ramsay plans to make the trip with his son James and his daughter, but preparing that trip was so difficult, or no was easy, because the children were not ready to go. On this trip, we can see how Mr. Ramsey changed his attitude with his children and his children toward him. On the same time, Lily is also part of the trip, and while sailing, she tries to finish Mrs. Ramsey painting.
When she was a kid, Virginia Woolf would go on holiday to a coastal town as well with a lighthouse, and it's been said in this documentary that I've linked to below that those were her happiest moments in childhood. Her sister Vanessa said she saw an almost perfect recreation of their parents in the characters Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey and their guests on the Scottish island on the Isle of Skye, which is a real Scottish island. Looks beautiful out there. There's Mr. Ramsay, who's as well known author of philosophy, whose source of a selling bold, ruminating, insecure patriarch. He's very much concerned with legacy and other and kind of obsessed with the idea of being forgotten. Like sort of just no achievement, the hakes. Then he aspired at an annihilation basically. The idea that will not be read in the future, and he's constantly in need of praises, whether from his wife or others. I think he also maintains sort of pessimistic viewpoint, which may in fact be Virginia's as well, and may be exacerbated by grief. We'll later see. I kind of picture him being played by Stella Skarsgård. If there was a film adaptation, he's kind of insidiously tyrannical, not constantly violent or anything, but has that sort of aura of a loose cannon. He can lose his temper, break things, cause the whole room to go quiet, a lot of tension within his mind. Mrs. Ramsey is his wife, who's sort of a source of beauty and stability for her family, admired by the guests, admired by almost everyone. I think there's a local poet named Mr. Carmichael, whose breath has been stained from his smoking opium. I thought that was nice touch. James Ramsey is their young son who in the beginning wants to go to the lighthouse, but Mr. Ramsey tells him the weather won't be suitable, and James gets the idea at this point in his childhood that Mr. Ramsey enjoys being cruel, and that's kind of the planning of this seed and hatred for his father that just grows as well. See by the end of the book. Lily Bryce-Coe is another character who is a visiting painter doing a portrait of Mrs. Ramsey, and whom I read according to Wikipedia. I think she's sort of like Woolf herself in she's pursuing a creative endeavor but insecure of it. A certain man, a character named Charles Stanley, takes a look at her work, her painting, and comments that women can paint and women can write. Perhaps Virginia Woolf was also uncertain and insecure about her own talents, understandably so, as that time she and women in general probably received a lot of unfair sexist criticisms for waiting to be artists. Though, her father, I read, actually was encouraging her being an author, and I think her family was encouraged her to be an author because it was, unacceptable just for a woman. And that time, even so, I have a hard time believing that it wasn't difficult to create challenging piece of literature as a woman at that time.
Finally, I enjoyed reading this book. I want to say that it's a masterpiece. In my opinion, this book has a very simple plot, but deep down, it has a very complex questions about our internal struggles, about human condition, about the relationships, about families, about death, and obviously about passing of the time. But I want to highlighting the value it has in reclaiming women and their role in the society, not only as a housewife, but as a person who has all the skills to fulfill any role in our society. And regarding this, I relate this book with the actual with the current context in Colombia, and the women called Mamás de la Primera Línea, who are women who are struggling in the current context with their children. They are women who rebelled against our system, and who wants a better world. And another relation is about Lily, the painter, and to me the woman in the world of art have been really important. For example, artists such as Remedios Varo, Leonora Carrington, or Maria Izquierdo. I also believe that Virginia Woolf is a woman who represents the universal literature because of her profound themes, deep themes, but with everyday actions. Each everyday action has a deep consequence, and I think Virginia Woolf talks about that. I think this is the most valuable thing about this writer, who found in everyday life, the strength to write about very deep and significant philosophical or existential questions. I recommend the book for those people who want to have another look at literature, a literature that connects us with our feelings, our mind, and I recommend this book for people who don't know much about literature writing by women. I think this book is a good example of how the whole inner world of a person can be manifest. So that's my recommendation.
In my personal opinion, To the Lighthouse is a very beautiful book where you can see how Virginia Woolf jumps from character to character in order to show the point of view of each one and also to delve into the thoughts and feelings to each one. You can also notice use of a stream of consciousness as a narrative strength, but for the same reason I think it is not a book for everyone. This text is for readers who have a lot of patience and have enough time to read slowly, not because it's more enjoyable, but because in this form of writing the paragraphs are very long and the punctuation doesn't not help to breathe. The book has a strange rhythm which prevents people who read in the free time or those who read waiting for a great event one after another can leave the reading or do not find too enjoyable.